Welcome to my first boat. In this channel we will show you the step-by-step restoration of our 40-foot vintage steel yacht, with the goal to someday living on it full time. I want to start today's show by giving you an update on our Perkins diesel engine, specifically about the exhaust system. In previous videos, I said several times that it's a wet exhaust system, and I was led to believe that because of these two hoses, which seemingly lead through the hull to the outside of the boat. But then, upon closer inspection and with the help of my friend, we found out that these hoses simply lead to the keel cooler, which is located on the outside of the hull. Which means that the exhaust on our boat is actually a dry exhaust. And yet still, the exit of the muffler is located halfway underneath the waterline. Which means that once the boat is in the water, this cylindrical muffler here at the end will fill up with water up to its lower third, presumably to reduce the noise coming from the exhaust system. Anyway, while we're here, let's remove this remaining glass wool from the exhaust pipe. This is what we have to work with, and luckily it comes off very easily. And just as with the muffler, there's a thick layer of rust and debris covering the entire pipe. So then I remove the superficial debris with a steel brush. And then I'm gonna leave it like this for the time being. After all, we have about 5 weeks left to figure out what we're gonna do with it. We had to weld in a support for this shelf inside of the engine room. Problem was that the other side was already painted. So I waited there with a wet towel. Okay. While my friend would do the welding. And I'm doing this just so that the paint doesn't catch on fire and makes a lot more damage than it does right now. And at the next opportunity we'll cover this up with paint and pretend nothing ever happened. Next, let's remove the panel here behind the steering wheel so that we can gain better access to that area. For that we first need to remove the steering wheel itself. And then we can remove the wooden panel. And I probably should have removed this before I started ripping out all the cables. It would have made the whole task much more easy. But as always, at that time, I didn't think about it. Next, I'm going to liberate all the engine gauges from inside this panel.
Go.
Another thing we did was to check the condition of the steering mechanism. While we are able to steer in both directions, there seems to be something blocking when steering all the way to the left.
Also hier ist schwer.
While using the steering wheel on the flybridge, it was a bit easier to steer in both directions, but I could still feel some resistance, so we're gonna have a look at that as soon as the tarpaulin comes off. Our next project is to empty out the water tank, which, if you remember, is about half full. For this I'm using the old water pump that came with the boat and connect it to the existing plumbing of the water tank. I extend the hose with one of the old bilge pump hoses and feed it through the through hull to the outside. I got a 200-liter water barrel, which should be enough to take in all the water from the tank. Next I'm building a little switch so I can operate the pump and connect it to a 12-volt power supply. So let's see if this works. And yes, indeed, it does work. So all I have to do now is let this run until the tank is empty. I took a little sample of the water to see if there is any rust or debris inside of the tank, and it turns out nothing, none at all. Alright, so the water tank is now empty, and I'm gonna proceed to try and remove this tube. And the pipe did come off, so now we are ready to build a new water system. Alright, next, as promised in our last video, a professional welder came and took care of the welding below the waterline. First he prepared the metal by cutting a groove into the old welds that I made before. Here he's welding a grounding metal right next to the area he's gonna weld on. So on with the first weld. Here we see 3 welds put on top of each other. By the way, the gas is a mix of argon and CO2. On this piece I hadn't welded yet from the outside. And here's a unique view on what happens on the other side of a weld. And here's the result you get with a mag welder. No slack, hardly any splatter, and just nice continuous welds. Now preparing the metal piece for the third and last area. Here the welder is using the grounding metal as a support bracket to hold the new piece in place, which avoids needing to use a magnet. Right now we are done on the outside, all that is left to do is to do the welding on the inside. We start with the one in the aft cabin, and then the ones in the forward cabin. And I don't know about you, but whenever I see the sparks flying, I get this intense feeling of melancholy. And this is what the welds look like from the inside, after I cleaned them up a little with a steel brush. Next thing to do for me is to grind the welds down a little, but not completely. The welder recommended to leave about a millimeter of height. We got a suction tool to help us with putting in the windows in the forward cabin.
Jetzt haben wir. Ja.
This should provide sufficient grip to be able to put the windows in a bit easier than before. This time we also made sure that we put in the seals in the right direction. And after struggling for several hours with these windows, it seems that the best way to do it is to put them in from the outside and then pull them in with that suction tool. Of course, we also considered the trick with a rope, but it turns out it's just not practical with these types of windows. Anyway, we managed to get them both in, so here they are. I got a sheet of plexiglass to replace one of the windows that was made of plastic, as you can see here. I traced the outline with a cutter knife. And I put it in my little workshop area here at the bow. For cutting, I use my Makita jigsaw with a saw blade for metal. I then clean up the edges with some rough sandpaper. And then the window is ready to be put back in. And there you have it. I left the protective foil on it for the time being, that's why it's pink. Alright, now we move on to the last job we will cover in this video, which is to permanently put in place the two forward hatches. I just put down a border of tape, and next I put the Sikaflex 552 elastic sealant. By the way, this is the third of 3 hatches which I put in the boat so far, so with this one I had the most experience and made the least mistakes, which I'm gonna show you in a moment. So here we put the hatch back on. Next I put a little bit of sealant into the screw holes before putting the screws back in, to make sure there's no water coming in from there. I clean up the surplus of sealant from below so that it doesn't clog up the screw nuts, and then put the nuts and washers on the screws. And then as I pull everything tight, you can see the surplus sealant being pressed out from underneath the hatch. And then comes my favorite part, which is cleaning up the surplus sealant. And I'm sure everybody who's ever done this can relate when I'm saying, this part of the job is a real bitch. And mind you, this is the best one I did. You'll see what I mean when I show you the second hatch I did. We start again with the border of tape, and then put down the sealant. I make sure there's a thick and even layer of sealant all around the area where the hatch will sit down. I gently put down the hatch, and here you see the first mistake. I put in the screws before putting in some sealant into the holes of the screws. Which I'm doing right here, but this is a couple of days later. And here you see the second big mistake I made, which was not to clean up the surplus sealant while it was still wet. The reason I didn't clean it up at the time was because it's such a mess to do that, and I thought the sealant would be easier to remove once it's dry. Well, not really. While you can remove most of it quite easily after it's already dried, there's a bunch of smaller pieces and strips and stripes here and there which are very difficult to remove. And after spending more than an hour of trying to get this clean, I decided to leave it like this and give it another try on another day. And that concludes our week number 25. We hope you had as much fun as we did, and that we're gonna see you again in the next video. Thanks for watching, take care, and bye bye.